What up, y'all? This is John Edward Willie, and today I'm talking about Project Lifeline. Project Lifeline is something that I initiated a few years ago, and it's turned out to be a really wonderful practice. What is that practice? Well, it's twofold. On the one hand, it means taking the time to simply walk like I am now and to record my thoughts, while I'm walking. Now, I usually do this using audio only, and I usually record my thoughts first thing in the morning as soon as I wake up, if I can. Of course, I do it at different points during the day, but I often try to use a kind of prompt or a question or a seed or some kind of starting point that allows me to give some kind of context or some kind of shape to my thoughts. Now, what you don't want to do is to prevent yourself from having organic, like free-floating, speculative thoughts. You don't want to stop yourself from speaking, as they say, in a stream of consciousness. You want to let that stream of consciousness out. But on the other hand, you don't want to really speak into a void and speak without any purpose or meaning whatsoever. So you want to, like, in a corresponding way, give yourself that ability to, what's up, bud? Good to see you. Good to see you, sir. Hell yeah. And you want to be able to give yourself that opportunity to really speak your mind. And speak your mind about what? I think that you can speak about things that are very practical. You can speak about things that are very close to your own heart. These aren't things that really have to be shown to anyone. But you can also speak about things, as I do, which are very abstract and sort of very removed from life. And what is one doing with these recordings, right? I think that there's something very special that happens in the act of recording yourself, even if you don't listen to the recording, because simply saying aloud what you were thinking allows you to hear in that moment those thoughts. And so you sort of expand upon that, like recognition. And on the other hand, there's a great deal of value to be found in sort of sitting down and not only listening to what it is that you're saying, but perhaps actively listening with a pen or paper in hand or a keyboard. That is sort of listening to yourself speaking spontaneously based on a certain script and sort of overhearing yourself, sort of processing like what it is that you say, so that you can in many ways understand much more clearly and much more expansively what your thoughts are. And this is based on like the time span that one would have. You know, you don't have all morning, although sometimes it's really wonderful to sort of like let yourself unfold, to let yourself speak at length. And at the same time, one can like make full use of like 20 minutes or even less, maybe 5 minutes or less of time. And again, it's based on what is on your mind, you know. I often use it like in states of difficulty as a way of like giving my own mind a kind of center, like giving my own mind a way of understanding itself. That is, I'll record and simply like speak openly about what's going on in my life. And later on, when I'm listening to that and then sort of like taking notes, I'm able to hear all kinds of things that I can't hear because I'm already too close to what I'm saying. So writing is like a double act, gives yourself a kind of like detached distance from what you're thinking and what you're seeing. And I think that the experience of surprise is precisely what keeps this thing going, because what one discovers is surprise about what one thinks. And this kind of self-discovery, I think, goes hand in hand with the process of self-examination. And I think that there's really no immediate outcome that comes from this practice. There's no real obvious outcome. In fact, it can make things much more difficult rather than easier. But the gains are really discovered in the sort of day-to-day practice of this routine. For instance, waking up, taking a walk, and recording my thoughts without really thinking about what I'm doing allows me to capture the dreamlike state of sleeping that tends to contain a lot of information that our conscious mind sort of necessarily like deletes. And when I sit down later to write, whether by hand or in typing, I discover by using prompts, by using thoughts like as starting points, or you sort of using like a shape to give it like some kind of form, I find that I create through this practice of writing on a day-to-day basis a great number of entries into my journal that I otherwise wouldn't have. Because the thing about speaking that's different than writing a journal is that you really can allow yourself to let go in a way where you're not held back by the limitations of your own hand. And in being able to let go, you can say quite a bit more, and you can also sort of overhear the elements that could be discarded. And that's sort of like one of the unique things about writing as opposed to speaking. In writing, you can effectively delete and change what it is that you say, but the singularity of speech means that once you say something, it really can't be unsaid, unless of course you're sort of editing videos and that kind of thing. But in real life, there's a stark difference between the two. And so I think this practice allows one to hear perhaps the things that one is saying without even realizing what they're saying. And I think so much of what goes on in the process of becoming a more capable kind of person, a more courageous, critical kind of person, occurs in this kind of like self-editing way. And we're lucky if we have someone close to us that can patiently and caringly articulate our limitations and our mistakes, right? But it's very easy to ignore these things when we're on our own. It's very easy to hide. And so this kind of practice allows one to sort of like get what you otherwise wouldn't have, like in not having like really, really great people. You know, if you're blessed to have a wonderful family or spouse or community that can positively reinforce this process, then there would be sort of no need for it. But if one is like a free-floating cowboy in a hyper-real postmodern state, that is, if one is living out the consequences of this idea that one ought to be completely self-sufficient, so to speak, then one discovers that there's a limitation to the kind of understanding that comes through pure self-sufficiency, meaning that it's really, really wonderful for people like myself who basically live alone and who thrive alone to have some kind of technology or tool for in sort of getting back what you don't get from an immediate collection of friends, or sort of like an immediate family or a partner who can help you, can listen to you, like adequately listen to you. That's something that is nearly impossible to find, is the listening ear. And so one must become the listening ear, and that's what this project Lifeline is about. And I give it a name because I am wanting to make something that was private to me, something that was very practical to me. I want to give it sort of a public name so that I can speak about it and carry it out as offering a kind of tool or a kind of technique that can replace therapy. Not like that I'm advocating not taking medication or anything like that, or that I'm advocating disregarding what it is that therapists and good counselors do. But I do think there's a great deal of autonomy to be found in recovering the idea of keeping a journal, not as a way of just talking about your feelings or just talking about yourself, but a journal that is an active access in challenging yourself, that a journal can operate as a kind of tool for opening up those parts of yourself that ought to be opened up, and address them directly in a way that a mature, independent person would do. And I say a lot of this tongue-in-cheek because it's sort of just really sad that people would think that they can live alone, especially the way that I do. I thrive in solitude, but I truly wouldn't recommend it for anyone, because it brings a lot of problems more than it does solutions. And I think that one invaluable way of addressing particular problems is through a practice of living on the earth, like staying grounded. So when I say lifeline, I'm using that phrase in many different ways. And I'm primarily referring to the act of pulling myself out of the clouds, like pulling myself out of like pure metaphysical, dreamlike speculation, which is where thinking people spend a lot of their time. Or I'm like shut off, like buried, like under the earth, and I have to be pulled back up to the earth, right? So there's two kinds of lifelines that I'm throwing. But what I'm doing, like fundamentally in recording myself talking and in writing this journal, is not trying to think philosophically, but trying to think as a human being and trying to bring my life together, trying to think as an earthbound brain, trying to imagine my situation as one containing a set of options that I can exercise, and seeing that as being, having a horizon, seeing it as being limited, but seeing it as something that in working with and for and against, one is in many ways defining themselves, discovering themselves in that. And this kind of striving, this kind of friction is sort of found like in people who are living on the earth. You know, you have to come back home to earth. And knowing the difference in writing between keeping a journal that is about my life and myself and separating that from all the other writing that I do, because I write a lot of essays that are very philosophical and speculative, but I also write poetry, I write stories, and a number of other things that often, if they're done in the act of keeping a journal, become so muddled that I become muddled. And so the very way that I save my life is by concentrating upon the instrumental immediacy of my life, the instrumental practical problems that I face. And as someone who is prone towards like very, very up in the air, very, very like I'm a very crazy thinker, like as someone that is not only sort of crazy, but like actively thrives in that kind of like cognitive dissonance, in that kind of like celebration of the life of the mind, it's pivotal that I'm able to still be sane and have a peaceful place within which I can not feel constantly as if my life were in a state of emergency. Because in many ways, that's the danger of the thinking life, is that it portends emergency. And learning how to navigate that kind of rupture, that kind of explosion that comes with thinking is something that demands a return to earth. And I speak metaphorically because, I'm trying to find another way of thinking about what I mean. But when I practice the lifeline, I'm doing something that is, for me, because of the state that I'm at with doing it, because of how long I've been practicing this, I've been able to make it into something a lot more than its most basic function. Because I use this act of recording myself speaking, listening to myself speaking, and writing, like actively taking notes, in fact, creating mind maps. I always create mind maps, but I also try to like type out in prose a version of what I'm saying. And I have always, for more than 10 years, written or typed more than 1,000 words a day. And most of that is pure garbage. Most of that is total crap, because so much of what I was doing for so long had to do with becoming a writer. And that involves writing without consideration for what one is writing for the simple act of writing, because one must be in the practice of writing. And yet this act, which in many ways felt very vacuous, was in fact pivotal, because when I later began recording myself speaking, again, as a practical thing that I'd done on my own for a long time, I discovered that there was a correlation between writing and speaking that could be worked upon, that could be developed. And that kind of relationship between the recording and the writing is a space within which I, as a thinking person, operate. And it's a part of my own circularity. Now I know that's very strange. I know that the way that I'm speaking is very murky, but when you're at the limits of analytical thinking, like, you have to be slightly poetical and use images as a way of conveying what it is that you're saying. And that's why when I speak of what I call corporealism, which is like my philosophy of beginning with the body rather than thinking of us as spirits or minds, I think about us not only as bodies but as corpses. When you think about yourself as a corpse, then you're grounded in a fundamental sense of what it means to be human. But that's not a negative or bleak thing. It means that we celebrate the fleshy nature of our existence without, sort of giving in to the various kinds of cynicism that loom when one is attempting to be clear about being a body. And this practice, I think, is key in being able to effectively see things as they are. Like, just to see clearly is the whole point. That's what was so hard for me as a thinking person to discover, which is that you don't have to have a thought about everything, although I still do. I find that simply seeing things as they are in a way of actively recording them is enough, because it sort of speaks for itself. It sort of speaks on its own terms. And there's a kind of release in that very act. And yet, what I've also found is that in properly labeling and titling all of these recordings, I sort of have a great reservoir or a treasure chest of recordings that have to do with every number of philosophical thoughts or topics regarding any number of things related to anything, because I've always already been fascinated with everything at once. And without being mystical about it, it meant being simply curious about everything and sort of wanting to connect everything to everything else. And so many of my recordings are synoptical like that. They're ways of connecting a particular topic or something to everything else. So the way that I think is slightly musical, It's musical insofar as I really don't see thinking or the act of truth-telling as something that can be systematic. It's not something that can be neatly organized. It's actually not really music either, because that is a mistaken, correlation. Thinking is something that is performative. And that doesn't mean that you're doing it as a trick or doing it to convince people of an illusion. What it means is that so long as you're thinking, nothing is certain. Like, there are no certainties. And that doesn't mean that everything is relative or subjective. It means that we are operating without the kind of confidence that we would like to have. And some of the smartest people have strived almost desperately to find grounds of confidence. In other words, they have pursued an explanation as to the foundation of mathematics. They've pursued an attempt to explain how it is that even science itself is not a process, but is something that is producing a kind of truth that is like a special place within culture where only scientists can speak about it. There are all of these different ways in which we end up playing these games with ourselves. And what I am wanting to do is to recover a human voice that, in listening to myself, can be recovered in the lines that I write. And I have been working on various journal entries that were written while listening to these various prompts. And I have about 10 to 20 journal entries from this year alone that are selected and sort of edited to preserve a state of consciousness. And I am hoping to publish these as a book that would be a reflection of my mind. And by reflection, I mean precisely that. The kind of reflection that happens quite naturally in the way that water reflects light, or that water might be drawn from a well. this attempt to capture my mind almost like photographically, and then to stitch it into writing, and then to reflect upon that thinking through the ongoing editing process, means that thoughts are sort of developed to a unique end. And they become things that are, like I said earlier, quite surprising, because one constantly, ideally, discovers surprising things about the world and about themselves through this. Now, I know that all of this is insanely incoherent, and I accept that, because I'm wanting to document this in time. I'm wanting to attempt to explain here on the record what it is that I'm doing when I upload recordings of my journal. I want there to be some understanding as to where these journals are coming from and the kind of process that led me to their production. And I think that process can help other people, should they be so inclined. Except that I'm not really so sure that anyone can be helped. You know, I'm not so sure that that's even a part of the project that I'm wanting to be a part of, because clearly that doesn't work. However, perhaps it's in soft selling it that I can sell it. And what I call a lifeline would simply be a way of practicing not therapy, but a way of listening to oneself that will allow oneself to make the most out of what kind of material is already there. And it's not only that it helps one get coherency and clarity about their life, but that one has an opportunity to record all kinds of things that one otherwise wouldn't find a person within which to plant those thoughts, you know? Maybe I'm saying something that is singular about myself and about my own situation and the routines that I have. But where I'm coming from is one of total exuberance. Where I'm coming from is this ecstatic state of having produced recently a number of stories, a number of articles, poems. I have almost 2 manuscripts full of poems and many other things, primarily essays, all of which are finding their own voice precisely by responding to my voice. And that question of voice, of style, is what we have to discover in ourselves, because it can't be taught. You know, the very act of becoming who you are is really only something that you can do by going into yourself and then having the courage to announce yourself, having the courage to become what you already are. And so this practice can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. I know that even the act of writing or recording oneself are fundamentally impossible acts for most people, because it does seem ridiculous. But there are certain techniques that, if you're ever in a emergency, like you don't have anybody to talk to, I think that if you took the time to record yourself and then you put on your headphones and not only listen to yourself, but write out what you hear and use it as a way of attuning yourself to how you actually are, to who you actually are, to your own messy, complicated, dense, impossible nature. Like, you can use this as an opportunity to really see yourself in your true nature, and no one else has to know. The one thing that I've discovered in all of the years of recording that I've been doing, I mean, I've been doing this since like 2014. I don't know what iPhone came out that year, but since about 2014, I've been walking and recording myself speaking, and I've been writing, and I've been doing it largely without really even thinking about what I'm doing. But it's turned out now to stun me with being a very unique way of doing philosophy and writing poems. That's so much that I haven't even spoken about. Like the other morning, I went out and took a walk, and the prompt that I used was that I was going to talk about my dreams. And for the first 20 minutes, I almost had nothing to say. I mean, it was largely incoherent. And then I stumbled into a way of organizing what seems clearly now to be 5 kinds of dreams that I've always had. And had I not done that recording, I would have had no grasp on my dreams. I mean, for starters, I've largely believed that dreams mean nothing, that it's self-referential. And so it's sort of pointless to even think about. But my mind has been changed because I'm sort of seeing in these patterns in my own dreams the mythology, like the very underlying fears and excitements in who I am. And this can't be done through a therapist. This can't be done through anyone outside of ourselves. It has to be done through our own endeavor to explore our interiority, to open up a space within ourselves. And I think that space within ourselves is the most important kind of space. And unfortunately, it's just completely overlooked, right? Because when I talk about inner space, when I talk about like an inner life, like if you can imagine such a thing, most people take it to mean like intoxication. They take it to mean mushrooms or any number of psychedelic techniques or DMT, or they imagine, for instance, that what's really important is outer space, going to Mars, developing a interplanetary system. And then there are others that say, no, it's really about exploring the deep oceans, that the deep oceans are untapped and that's where the wealth lies. And so like the question in Marxist or historical people will say that it's in the past, that it's by uncovering the past. And the more that we uncover the past, like the more we can understand ourselves. And then you have all the geeks that are like utopian people who are thinking about the future. And they're all saying, no, we need to plan for the future. We need to get ready for what's coming. I think that all of these people are making a mistake because they're all misplacing the very source, what should be the privileged locus of human activity, which is the immediacy of each of our worlds, which is everything, the earth, the plenitude, right? The plenitude of life, the deepest parts of life, like what is really, really, really most meaningful is in fact right in front of you. It is in fact something that is not obvious, but has everything to do with a state of mind. It has everything to do with the way that you attenuate yourself, the ways that you activate your consciousness. Like the meaning of your life that's right in front of your eyes has everything to do not with life itself, but with the cliche, quotidian, like really shallow versions of life that you can't let go of. We inherit all of this baggage, layer upon baggage. And I think that we are really bamboozled by charlatans who themselves are just deeply confused about what is to be valued, and how it is that we're to think about what it is to be valued. Now, I am definitely not alone in sort of thinking that I have something unique to say about that. But what I propose is a notion that many others have proposed, and yet it's really overlooked because it's not very sexy, it's not very revolutionary, it's not exactly entertaining, but it has to do with seeing that what is most crucial is learning how to pay attention, learning how to see. And yet that itself is something that is boring. It's overlooked because what is lacking is the fact that in order to see this, it can't be forced upon you. You have to change your mind. It's really that we can turn inside in a way that is very mysterious. Like there's no program, there's no set of prescriptions or even a really clear understanding about what this means, but in ways that are ethical and political, but also in ways that have to do with art and aesthetics, but also in ways that have to do with like total common sense. The ability to make that turn in yourself might feel to be an interior thing, but what is in fact turning is that your eyes are opening. The eyes are opening to the world itself. And not only that, but it goes hand in hand with the active process of learning how to see more clearly, how to pay better attention, how to use your eyes, to use your senses, and to see. Now that is very complicated if you're philosophical like I am. Like, one of my favorite subjects is called hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is, sort of the fruit of 19th century German philology, specifically Wilhelm Dilthey. And Dilthey's conception of hermeneutics simply means that perception is fundamentally interpretive. And this is something that can be overlooked as inane or stupid, or something that can perhaps be challenged. But it in fact is not an idea, but an explanation of how we are in the world. And what that means in regards to attention is that the number of things at any given moment that you can pay attention to is nearly infinite. It's nearly inexhaustible. Like, the particularities of your world in regards to sensory information, I hate that word information, but sensory input, the things that you can select to focus on is mind-boggling. You can simply slow down and just look around at any given moment and discover, so long as you're practicing this, you discover this thing that is always opening in front of you. And that has to do even with the face of other people, just looking at their faces. It's never ending. And I'm not trying to stress any mystical thing or anything even poetical. But what I mean to suggest is that this makes one aware of how we constantly focus on things that we think are natural, that we think are obvious, but they're only obvious because we notice them. And what's strange is that it often reflects what's going on within us. That's probably obvious to many people, but the things that we notice are often having little to do with the things themselves and everything else to do with the person that's noticing them. And that's why, in a different way that's unrelated to this, why anger and love are what they are, not as ideas perhaps, but as states of mind, as ways of being in the world that are attuning you to different properties, to different things. And again, that's for another talk, because what I mean to stress here is the fact that when we relax, we begin to observe ourselves. And so when we're relaxing and observing ourselves and not judging ourselves, but just simply observing, you start to see things that aren't bad, they're not good, they're not anything. They are what you are, and what they are things that you notice. And if you're getting really emotional and you're thinking constantly about it, you won't notice it because it'll just be what you are. But I think in practicing this attention to oneself, you then begin to become attentive to attention, and you begin to see where your eye goes. And what's really hard about this is that there doesn't seem to be any alternative. Every thought in its logical connection to every other associated thought becomes as clear as day. And that's why people can have such drastically different points of view about the very same subject, because our minds can go in a million different directions, and much of it is very similar, and so people have similar points of view. But what they have a hard time often even accepting is the other point of view, whether it's in various forms, understood historically or culturally or even racially. These others are often excluded from communities because of what they see, and because of what is natural to them is taken to be evil. And I think all of that is irrelevant, because I'm not making a political proposal. What I'm meaning to suggest is that the meaning in your life, the sense of significance, of beauty and joy and love on a daily basis, is something that opens itself up so long as you are attuning yourself to its sources. And yet, as I stressed earlier, this isn't a passive thing. It involves work. And what that work means is that you are using, instead of being used by your emotions and thoughts and imagination and being destroyed by them, by being detached and by attuning yourself to like what you can focus on, you can then use your imagination and feelings and thoughts to construct meaning. And that's why you can construct so many different kinds of meanings, not only based on the same things that you're focusing on, but the various other things that you can focus on. And most people really give up at this point because thinking then is so open-ended that there almost seems to be no point at all. But that's what I think the musical nature of thinking is. And thinking is practical and focused on critical things and solving problems. That's why I keep the life notebook that I keep and practice the lifeline. But life as a musical thing is sort of like joyous into itself. And that's why I connect it with the Baroque. That's why I connect it with Vivaldi and Handel and Caravaggio, and specifically French cathedrals, because what you see in the Baroque and the Rococo is a specific kind of affirmation of what to us is meaningless. And it's meaningless to us because we think in terms of output, like teleological future meaning. We don't really think about meaning as something that can just exist as itself. And that is how we experience music in many ways, is something that isn't pointing at something outside of itself, but it's meaningful in itself. That is what has always dazzled so many philosophers about music. There's a particular kind of experience in listening to music that is different than other art forms, because music is not about something. It's not thinking symbiotically in terms of signs and signifiers. The signs are the meaning themselves. And that has often puzzled those in philosophy. And yet it's even more puzzling to imagine that philosophy itself could actually be more similar to music than it is to science. Now that thought is a terrifying thought to the philosophically minded, but it could be that art and philosophy and science are not reducible to one another. Now that's a whole other idea, right? Is art thinking, like, is aesthetics a different kind of logic than science? That's a whole other kind of conversation, you know. But the question is whether or not we can save a way of thinking that can give us back the meaning without thinking that it has to be about something, but that it's resonant in itself. And I think that that's what philosophical speculation is, except that it accidentally has effects that are unexpected. Meaning that in mathematics, you know, there's a world of mathematicians who live, like, not only at MIT, but in different histories and different societies. Mathematicians have lived basically like shamans. Like, they live isolated lives and they practice things that people don't understand, but they keep them around because from time to time it turns out that what one mathematician was doing at one point has a rapturous effect on something at another point. And so that's the strange heuristics of speculation and speculative thought, meaning that you really don't ever know what your thoughts might lead to or what kind of consequence they may have even beyond your own life. And that also attunes one to the fact that philosophy is a process, meaning that there's no content in philosophy itself, right? So philosophy and music and mathematics have that in common. And I don't think it's a put down of philosophy, right? It's not a put down, but it's a way of looking at philosophy that sees that if mathematics were taught in the way that philosophy is taught, mathematics would never have anything to offer. And yet mathematics in many ways perpetually offers a kind of architecture for our technological world. And that need to see it as a process is as pivotal as music as seen as being a process. And that's why it's not musical content per se that's taught, but musical technique that's ultimately taught as a way of keeping alive this tradition. And so there's a vague, like, imagistic, like, association between mathematics and music and philosophy. and it's open-ended. But I think that the practice of keeping a life notes journal, of recording yourself and allowing yourself to like speak at length, and then to like discipline yourself to listen to it and to pull out of it the truth out of what you're saying, and to be honest with yourself, but also to use it not just as that way of thinking more clearly, but as a way of having fun. Because that's what I mean by connecting philosophy with music and mathematics. Like, it's fun. And the thing that's fun about it is its lack of certainty. And yet there are particular like notions that are being kept alive about it. And those kind of like notions are very hard to grasp, very elusive, and they're principles and patterns that connect contemporary philosophy to what the ancient Athenians were doing. That's why there is something we call philosophy, because there is a sort of tenuous connection between the patterns and principles that Aristotle and even Lucretius were using and what we're doing today when we think. But explaining that can't be exactly reduced down to a set of principles or ideas. That's what makes this a little bit ambiguous, a little bit complicated, because the question is, if there is meaning in philosophy that is a process, then how is it like music or mathematics? And that's where the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein comes in. And so much of my adult life has been this like love-hate affair with Wittgenstein. And I think that understanding him over time has really, really attuned me to what it is that's going on philosophically within my own writing and my own practice and my own process. And yet that's a very, very tricky thing to explain. You know, I'm always perhaps trying to say too much at once, but Wittgenstein is one of the few philosophers who understood that philosophy was a process. And the other philosopher who understood this was Plato. And I probably brought this up before, but both Plato and Wittgenstein are rarely like connected, but they deserve to be connected because they saw thinking as being something that was not correlated with living, but that it was living itself. And that's something that I think the Life Notes project is attempting to elucidate, which is that thinking is a living thing. And to stitch thinking into living begins perhaps with taking a walk and letting yourself talk. But that's just the starting point, right? Because at the same time that many other things are ending and dying off in the process of doing this, there's something else almost unsaid that's beginning at the same time. And I'm John Edward Willie, and I hope you have a good day.